Good evening. I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Welcome to Truth Report, the show that follows the money, traces the power, and names the names. Tonight, we're pulling the curtain back on a global economic war that's accelerating faster than most people realize, and the decisions being made right now that will determine who controls the industries of the future.
We've got a packed show tonight. The European Union just unveiled one of its most aggressive industrial policy packages in decades, and the crosshairs are aimed squarely at Beijing. We're going to break down exactly what Brussels is doing and why. Then, the death of Song Ping at 108 years old, a man whose career literally spanned the entire history of modern China, and what his passing tells us about the Communist Party's grip on its own mythology.
And we're going to take a hard look at BYD's brand new flagship electric SUV, the Great Tang, because this isn't just a car launch. This is a shot across the bow of every Western automaker, and it connects directly to that EU policy package in ways that the mainstream press is not spelling out for you.
So buckle up. Let's get into it.
Let's start with our lead story. The European Union has just launched what can only be described as a sweeping overhaul of its industrial policy, and reporting from the South China Morning Post in Hong Kong makes it clear. The common thread running through every single one of these proposals is that the screws are being turned tighter and tighter on Chinese firms operating in Europe. This is not incremental adjustment. This is a strategic pivot.
And Maya, the timing here is absolutely critical. Europe has been watching for years as Chinese manufacturers have flooded its markets with products that are not only cheaper but increasingly higher quality. We're talking about electric vehicles, solar panels, telecommunications equipment, advanced batteries. The European industrial base is under siege, and what Brussels announced this week is essentially an admission that the status quo is untenable.
That's right. According to the South China Morning Post's reporting, these proposals reveal deep anxiety within the bloc about Europe's ability to compete with what they describe as cut-price and increasingly high-quality Chinese products. But here's where it gets really interesting. This isn't just about economics. There are heightened security fears connected to Chinese investments in European infrastructure. Brussels is treating this as a national security issue now, not just a trade dispute.
Let's break down what's actually in this package, because the devil is in the details. The EU is rolling out a raft of policies designed to simultaneously kickstart sluggish European industry and protect critical infrastructure. We're talking about screening mechanisms for foreign investment, restrictions on state-subsidized competitors accessing European markets, and new rules around procurement that would effectively lock out firms that benefit from what Brussels considers unfair government backing.
And when they say foreign investment screening and state-subsidized competitors, let's be honest about what they mean. They mean China. They're not naming Belarus. They're not worried about Vietnamese solar panels. This is a China strategy dressed up in the language of level playing fields and fair competition. The newfound urgency the South China Morning Post identifies is really about one thing: Europe woke up and realized it was losing the industrial race.
Now here's what I want our viewers to understand, because this is the part that gets buried in the policy language. When the EU talks about protecting critical infrastructure, they're talking about ports, telecommunications networks, energy grids, data centers. Chinese firms have made significant inroads into all of these sectors across Europe over the past decade. And the security establishment in Brussels has been sounding the alarm for years that this represents a strategic vulnerability.
The question we need to ask is who benefits and who loses from this package. European manufacturers benefit, obviously. Companies that have been getting undercut by Chinese competitors will get some breathing room. European defense and security hawks benefit because they've been pushing for exactly this kind of decoupling. But here's the other side: European consumers could lose. If you restrict competition, prices go up. And European companies that have integrated Chinese supply chains into their operations are going to face massive disruption.
And there's a bigger geopolitical dimension here that we cannot ignore. This EU move is happening in the context of an escalating global trade war. The United States has been ratcheting up pressure on China for years now. Tariffs, export controls on semiconductors, restrictions on investment. What Europe is signaling with this package is that it is no longer trying to play the middle ground between Washington and Beijing. It is picking a side, or at the very least, it is protecting its own flank in a way that aligns much more closely with American strategic interests than with Chinese ones.
And that alignment has consequences. Beijing will respond. China has already shown it's willing to use economic leverage against countries that challenge its interests. We've seen it with Australia, we've seen it with Lithuania, we've seen it with South Korea. European businesses with exposure to the Chinese market should be watching this very carefully, because retaliation is not a matter of if but when and how.
What strikes me about this whole situation is the admission embedded in these policies. For years, European leaders talked about engagement with China, about mutual benefit, about the rules-based international order bringing China into the fold. This package is a tacit acknowledgement that that strategy has failed. Europe is now in defensive mode, trying to protect industries it allowed to atrophy while cheap imports flowed in and domestic investment went elsewhere.
And let's connect this to the working people of Europe, because policy papers from Brussels can feel abstract. When a Chinese electric vehicle manufacturer can sell a car in Europe for 15 to 20,000 euros less than a comparable European model, that's not just a pricing issue. That's factories closing. That's supply chains relocating. That's communities built around automotive manufacturing watching their economic foundation crumble. The EU is trying to stop that bleeding, but the question is whether these measures are too little, too late.
We're going to come back to that question when we talk about our next story, because it connects directly. But first, let's shift to a story that on the surface might seem like a simple obituary but actually tells us something profound about the nature of power in China.
Song Ping, one of the most senior surviving veterans of the Chinese Communist Party, has died at the age of 108. According to Xinhua, China's state news agency, he passed away at 3:36 in the afternoon in Beijing on Wednesday. Xinhua described him as a loyal communist fighter and an outstanding state and party leader. And those words matter, because in the Chinese Communist Party, how you are eulogized tells you everything about your political standing at the moment of death.
Song Ping's career is almost impossible to comprehend in its scope. It began in the 1930s, before the founding of the People's Republic of China. Think about that for a moment. This man's political career predates the country in its current form. He served as political secretary to Zhou Enlai, who would become the first premier of the People's Republic. That is not a footnote. Zhou Enlai is one of the most revered figures in Chinese Communist Party history, and Song Ping was in his inner circle.
And what's remarkable is that Song Ping didn't just survive one era of Chinese politics. He survived all of them. He lived through 5 generations of Communist Party leaders. He navigated the Founding Revolution, the Mao era, the Cultural Revolution, the Deng Xiaoping reforms, the Jiang Zemin period, the Hu Jintao period, and the Xi Jinping era. Each of those transitions was marked by purges, factional warfare, and political destruction. The fact that Song Ping died at 108, in his bed, with a full state eulogy, tells you he was one of the most politically adept survivors in the history of the Chinese Communist Party.
Now, why does this matter beyond the obituary page? Because Song Ping's death represents the severing of one of the last living links to the revolutionary generation. The men and women who actually fought in the Civil War, who actually built the People's Republic from the ground up, are almost all gone now. And that matters because the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party has always been rooted in that revolutionary narrative. When the last people who lived it are gone, the party has to find new sources of legitimacy.
And this is where it gets really interesting from an analytical perspective. Xi Jinping has been very deliberately constructing a new narrative of legitimacy based on national rejuvenation, on the idea that China is reclaiming its rightful place as a great power. The death of figures like Song Ping accelerates that transition. The revolutionary generation can no longer speak for themselves. Their legacy becomes entirely a matter of how the current leadership chooses to interpret and present it.
There's also a factional dimension here that Western media often overlooks. Song Ping held many important positions during his career. He was connected to networks of power and patronage that shaped Chinese politics for decades. When a figure like this passes, it doesn't just remove a person from the scene. It reshuffles the deck in subtle ways. Protégés lose a patron. Political networks lose a node. The balance of influence shifts, even if imperceptibly.
And the language of the eulogy itself is worth examining. Loyal communist fighter is not accidental phrasing. In a system where political language is as carefully calibrated as it is in China, calling someone a loyal fighter is a specific signal. It says this person stayed within the bounds of acceptable political behavior throughout their career. It's a stamp of approval from the current leadership, a way of claiming Song Ping's legacy for the present regime.
What I find most telling is what this moment reveals about the Chinese Communist Party's relationship with its own history. The party is obsessed with historical narrative. It publishes official histories, it controls how events are taught, it punishes those who deviate from the approved version. Song Ping's death and the way it's being handled is part of that ongoing project. The party is writing the final chapter on the revolutionary generation, and it's writing it in a way that serves its current political needs.
And for our international audience, here's why you should care. The way China's leadership thinks about its own history directly shapes how it engages with the world. The narrative of national humiliation, of a century of weakness followed by revolutionary rebirth and now rejuvenation, that's not just domestic propaganda. It's the framework through which Beijing makes decisions about trade, about territorial disputes, about military posture. Understanding figures like Songping and what they represent helps you understand why China acts the way it does on the global stage.
Well said. Now let's pivot to our third major story tonight, and this one is going to tie everything together in a way that I think will surprise some of our viewers. BYD, the Chinese electric vehicle giant, has just pulled the cover off its brand new flagship electric SUV for the first time. It's called the Great Tang, and according to reporting from Electrek, the images are stunning.
Let's talk about what BYD is doing here, because this is not just another car launch. BYD has been on an absolute tear. They've become the world's largest electric vehicle manufacturer, and the Great Tang represents their push into the premium flagship segment. This is BYD saying, we don't just make affordable EVs. We can compete at the very top of the market. We can build vehicles that match or exceed anything coming out of Germany, Japan, or the United States.
And this is where the connections between our stories tonight become impossible to ignore. Remember that EU industrial package we just discussed? The one designed to protect European industry from Chinese competition. BYD's Great Tang is exactly the kind of product that is driving European policymakers to panic. This isn't some cheap knockoff. This is a vehicle that, based on BYD's track record, will offer cutting-edge battery technology, advanced autonomous driving features, and a level of fit and finish that rivals established luxury brands, and it will almost certainly do it at a lower price point.
According to Electrek's coverage, the Great Tang's official debut is just days away, and the timing couldn't be more provocative from a geopolitical standpoint. BYD is unveiling a vehicle that represents everything the EU is trying to defend against, right as Brussels is rolling out its most aggressive protectionist measures in a generation. This is a collision course, and the automotive industry is ground zero.
Let's talk about what's under the hood of BYD's strategy, because it's not just about one SUV. BYD has vertically integrated its supply chain in a way that no Western automaker has matched. They make their own batteries, their own semiconductors, their own electric motors. They control the entire production chain from raw materials to finished vehicle. That gives them a cost advantage that tariffs alone cannot overcome, and European manufacturers know it.
And here's the uncomfortable truth that the established auto industry doesn't want to talk about. BYD's quality has been improving at a rate that has shocked the industry. Independent teardowns of BYD vehicles by Western engineering firms have found that the build quality, the technology integration, the battery efficiency are not just competitive. In some areas, they are class-leading. The Great Tang, as a flagship, is going to be BYD's showcase for everything they can do at the highest level.
Now, BYD is not just a private company pursuing market share out of pure entrepreneurial spirit. And this is where we need to be honest about the power structures at play. BYD has benefited enormously from Chinese state support. Subsidies, preferential land deals, government-backed loans, access to cheap rare earth minerals controlled by state entities. The playing field is not level, and it never has been. When the EU talks about unfair competition from state-subsidized firms, BYD is Exhibit A.
But here's the complication, and this is where the story gets really nuanced. Even if you strip away every subsidy, BYD would still be an incredibly competitive company. They've invested heavily in research and development. They've iterated faster than their Western competitors. They've built a talent pipeline that is producing world-class engineers. So while the subsidy argument is valid, it's also incomplete. Part of what's happening here is simply that Chinese industry has become genuinely excellent at building electric vehicles, and the West wasn't ready for that.
And this is the core tension in the EU's new industrial strategy. You can put up trade barriers. You can screen investments. You can restrict market access. But you cannot legislate innovation. If European automakers don't match the pace of technological development coming out of companies like BYD, all the protectionist measures in the world will only delay the inevitable. They won't prevent it.
The Great Tang specifically represents BYD's ambition to move upstream into the luxury market, where European automakers, particularly the Germans, have traditionally dominated. When a Chinese company can credibly compete with BMW, Mercedes, and Audi on their home turf, that's not just a business story. That's a story about the shift in global industrial power. And naming the vehicle the Great Tang, after one of the most powerful dynasties in Chinese history, is a deliberate statement of intent. This is about more than cars.
Let's also talk about what this means for consumers, because in all the geopolitical maneuvering, actual human beings sometimes get lost. If BYD can deliver a premium electric SUV at a significantly lower price than European alternatives, that's good for consumers. It accelerates the transition away from fossil fuels. It puts downward pressure on prices across the market. The EU's protectionist measures, whatever their strategic justification, work against those consumer interests. That's a real trade-off, and policymakers need to be honest about it.
Absolutely. And it's worth noting that the environmental dimension of this story is enormous. The faster we get affordable, high-quality electric vehicles into the market, the faster we reduce transport emissions. If trade barriers slow that process, there's a genuine environmental cost. The EU has to balance its industrial protection goals against its climate commitments, and right now, those two priorities are on a collision course.
Alright, let's bring all of this together, because when you look at tonight's stories as a whole, a very clear picture emerges. We are living through one of the most significant shifts in global economic power in modern history. China's industrial machine has reached a level of sophistication that is forcing the rest of the world to react, and the reactions are getting more aggressive by the month.
The EU's industrial package is a defensive response to a challenge that has been building for years. Song Ping's death marks the end of the revolutionary generation and the full emergence of a China that defines itself not by past struggle but by present and future dominance. And BYD's Great Tang is a tangible, gleaming symbol of that ambition, rolling off production lines and into showrooms around the world.
What worries me is that the response from Western governments is overwhelmingly protectionist rather than competitive. Tariffs, investment screens, procurement restrictions. These are all walls. And walls can buy you time, but they don't make you faster or better. The real question is whether Europe and the United States will use the time these barriers buy to actually invest in innovation, in education, in research and development, or whether they'll simply hide behind the walls and hope the problem goes away.
And history tells us what happens when established powers rely on protection instead of adaptation. They decline. Not overnight. Not dramatically. But steadily, irreversibly. The British textile industry didn't lose to automation because it lacked tariffs. Detroit didn't lose to Japanese automakers because of insufficient trade barriers. They lost because they stopped innovating, stopped investing, and assumed their dominance was permanent. Europe's auto industry is at that same inflection point right now.
There's also a deeper question about the kind of global economy we want to build. If the response to Chinese competition is purely protectionist, we end up with a fragmented world of competing economic blocs, each hiding behind their own walls. Trade slows. Innovation fragments. Consumers pay more. The climate transition decelerates. Nobody wins that scenario except the politicians who get to claim they protected domestic jobs in the short term.
And let's not let China off the hook either, because this is Truth Report and we call it straight. China's state subsidies do distort markets. Chinese firms do benefit from a system that doesn't play by the same rules as open market economies. Intellectual property protections in China remain inadequate. Market access for foreign firms in China is still heavily restricted. There are legitimate grievances on the European side of this equation. The answer is not to pretend that Chinese competition is entirely fair. The answer is to be honest about the complexity and then compete like your future depends on it, because it does.
What we're watching unfold is the defining economic contest of this century. The EU's new industrial package, Song Ping's passing, BYD's Great Tang. These aren't isolated stories. They're chapters in the same book. And that book is about whether the established powers of the 20th century can adapt fast enough to remain relevant in the 21st, or whether they'll be remembered the way every declining power is remembered, as the ones who thought they could wall themselves off from the future.
And for our viewers at home, this matters to you directly. The price of your next car, the security of your job, the speed of the energy transition, the stability of the global economy. All of it is connected to the decisions being made right now in Brussels, Beijing, and boardrooms around the world. This is not abstract geopolitics. This is your life.
That's our show for tonight. We covered the EU's sweeping new industrial strategy and its direct targeting of Chinese firms, the death of Song Ping and what the passing of China's revolutionary generation means for the future of the Communist Party, and BYD's Great Tang, the flagship electric SUV that embodies everything the West fears and everything Chinese industry has become.
As always, we don't just report the news. We follow the money, trace the power, and connect the dots. The sources for tonight's stories include the South China Morning Post's diplomatic and political coverage and Electrek's automotive reporting. We encourage you to read these sources yourself. An informed public is the best defense against those who would rather you didn't pay attention.
I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity.
Stay sharp. Stay skeptical. And we'll see you next time on Truth Report.
Good night.